Hey everyone, I know this might not be for everyone, but I thought I'd do a quick Kenobi review, and hopefully there's at least a couple of nerds in the audience who will enjoy it. And of course, I use the word nerd affectionately. I'm into this stuff myself, which is probably obvious, or I wouldn't have bothered sitting down and watching the show. And so I've watched the first three episodes. In fact, I watched them all twice. And I have to admit that during the first run through, I wasn't sure what I thought. There was some stuff I thought was a bit awkward or cringy, possibly some plot holes, but I was surprised when I watched the episodes for the second time. I found myself liking them more, with the exception of the third episode, sadly. I found the third episode, where we finally get to see Vader and Kenobi come face to face, to be the most problematic and disappointing, but I'll get into that later near the end. So let's dig in. I really liked the prequel recap that we see at the beginning of the first episode. I'm not a huge fan of the prequels, but I did really like Revenge of the Sith and getting to finally see Anakin turn to the dark side, and that's mostly what the recap focuses on. And so I think the first scene we get after that features a bunch of kids in big helmets doing Tai Chi. That's what it looks like. At what I think is the Jedi Temple. And then suddenly clone troopers invade. And this, of course, is Order 66, when in the prequels, Palpatine, aka the Emperor, aka Darth Sidious, orders all the clones to suddenly turn on and eliminate all the Jedi. And so the female Jedi who had been instructing the children in the comically big helmets starts taking out clone troopers left and right with her lightsaber in an attempt to defend the children. And this was the first thing that I really had a problem with. She's killing all these clone troopers with her lightsaber once again, but there's no marks or damage on their armor. Okay, my bad. I went back and started watching the first episode again. I was looking for screenshots I could use for the YouTube version, and maybe it was because I was watching it on my computer with the screen closer to my eyes, but I was wrong. There are lightsaber burns on the clone trooper's armor. I just wanted to straighten that out. Okay, mea culpa. And we now return to the Week in Doubt already in progress. And so I'm thinking this must be some Disney thing where they're watering things down for kids and don't want any graphic violence. But then later in the same episode, the character Riva brutally lops off an old woman's hand in the marketplace or town square or whatever with her lightsaber, and the hand falls to the ground and they show a close up of it. Then later, technically it was earlier, the same character, Riva, sadistically burns a man's arm with her lightsaber. And then in episode 3, a stormtrooper falls on top of some kind of laser fence and is completely cut in half. They show his bisected body. And so I'm like, well, there goes my theory about some kind of policy against graphic violence. So I don't know if they just forgot or neglected to go back in and add laser marks to the clone trooper's armor, or if it was a conscious decision not to, who knows. But that jumped right out at me at the beginning, and was the first thing to kind of interrupt my suspension of disbelief, and that was just the first scene. And so, once again, in the spirit of fairness, that was an invalid or unfair criticism. There was indeed burn marks on the trooper's armor. And also, apologies if it sounds like I'm talking through a tin can during these little edits. It always sounds that way when I record inside iMovie as opposed to GarageBand. I'm working on the YouTube version right now as I'm catching these mistakes. Alright, and once again, we now return to the Week in Doubt, already in progress. And that might sound like unnecessary nitpicking to some, but people notice that kind of stuff, and enough sloppy mistakes or continuity errors or little things like that, they can add up and start to turn people off or affect how they view the show. I guess next I'll talk about the Inquisitors, and as I mentioned when commenting on the trailer a while back, the Inquisitors are basically these bad guys that hunt Jedi and answer to Darth Vader. I think they first appeared in Star Wars Rebels, which was animated, And people weren't sure how they would translate to live action. And unfortunately, as people had feared, I think they do end up looking kind of goofy in this, especially the fifth brother character, I think it is. He looks like he's just wearing gray face paint and this big oversized plastic bicycle helmet. There seems to be a thing with this show in comically oversized helmets. I know there is a guy with that kind of helmet in the animated TV show, Star Wars Rebels, but it ends up looking kind of goofy in this. And then there's the Grand Inquisitor. A lot of fans were complaining that his head shape was wrong in the trailer, and were hoping that maybe they'd fix it before the release of the actual show. But no, they didn't. And it was very bizarre because the species that he belongs to was actually in the prequel movies, and they have these big, long, kind of oval heads. So they had already established the look of that species. And then he appears as a member of that species in the show Star Wars Rebels. And then the character appears again in this Kenobi series, but they give him this weird little, round bulbous head. And there were complaints, but I guess they just decided not to do anything about it. Why they got the head shape wrong in the first place, I don't know. Did they think they couldn't achieve it practically? Well, they already proved they could do it in the prequels, which were, like 17 years ago? So they should have been able to do it now. But I have to say, the performance of the actor playing the Grand Inquisitor really started to grow on me, to the point where I started forgetting about the issues I had with his appearance. Every once in a while, though, I'd notice that the little cups he was wearing over his ears kind of looked like they were molded out of, cheap plastic, which, let's be honest, they probably were. I think my favorite Inquisitor is probably the fourth sister, I think it is. The woman who looks like she has little tentacles coming out of her head and just kind of hangs around in the back. She has a cool look, and it's hard to be annoying when you're not really talking, That leaves the character of Riva, who I mentioned earlier, and there's been a lot of controversy surrounding this character and the actress who plays her. And this goes all the way back to the release of the trailer, in which the character is first revealed. You had anti-SJW, anti-political correctness types coming out and saying that this was forced diversity, that they were trying to shoehorn this woman of color into the show, and that it was a bait and switch, and that she'll end up being the main character, not Obi-Wan. And I myself, being a decent person, or at least I hope I'm a decent person, I was like, it shouldn't matter what color the actor's skin is. That should go without saying. Although there may be some instances where an actor's color or ethnicity might matter. Like if you're casting an MLK biopic, you'd probably want a black lead. But a case like this, a made-up fantasy character without an established ethnicity that I'm aware of, other than being a space human, who cares? And so I went in, really trying to be open-minded, trying to be receptive to the character, wanting to like her. But damn, personally, I just found the character to be really annoying and unlikable or off-putting. In fairness, she is supposed to be a villain, or at least she starts out as one. I think there's a rumor that at the end there could be a switcheroo. But there's, the entertaining villain that we love to hate. And then there's just a character we don't like because they're poorly written or poorly acted or directed or some combination. I think part of the problem might be that, this is a character we've just met, and right out the gate, her personality or attitude is dialed all the way up. She's bullying innocent civilians, she's a villain, and constantly fighting with her fellow Inquisitors, talking back to the Grand Inquisitor. It just makes the character come off as obnoxious. And so, suffice to say, not a big fan of the character, at least not so far. But I feel I should stop and mention that the actress who plays her, Moses Ingram, I think it is, has supposedly been receiving threats and racist comments online, and obviously it should go without saying that, that's reprehensible. It's fine not to like a character and to voice your criticisms. That's what I'm doing right now. But you shouldn't go after the actor. They're a real life, flesh and blood human being just trying to live and make their way in the world like the rest of us. But I will add a caveat. If an actor says something kind of stupid or foolish publicly, I think it's all right to give them a little pushback. And I'd heard that supposedly she made some kind of comment where she kind of insinuated that she may have been the first black person or person of color in Star Wars, and people had to remind her. You had Billy D. Williams as Lando, you had Forrest Whitaker, you had John Boyega as Finn, and of course, one of the most iconic characters from the entire franchise, Darth Vader, was voiced by the great James Earl Jones. And you also had a number of Hispanic actors, I think, including, of course, Jimmy Smits. And I believe Oscar Isaac, who played Poe Dameron, I think he's Hispanic too. I think he's from Guatemala. And so, heavy spoilers, there's gotta be a lot of them. When the Inquisitors first come to town, ordinary people are aware of who they are, and then later Obi-Wan demonstrates that he knows who they are. I believe he explains it to Leia. And yet at the end of the third episode, actually it's the end of the second episode. I think I need to take my brain in for an exam. Okay. The big reveal, Riva tells Obi-Wan that Anakin is Vader and that he's still alive, and Obi-Wan acts all shocked and traumatized. But, and here I'm getting really nerdy, we know from the prequels, specifically Revenge of the Sith, that Obi-Wan sees and hears via security footage the very moment Palpatine gives Anakin the name Vader, or at least one of the early times he refers to him as Vader. So Obi-Wan has known for 10 years that Anakin is Darth Vader. He knows about the Inquisitors, but he doesn't know that they work for Vader, or he's never heard anyone even mention Vader over the last decade. Seems unlikely. Then let's see, looking at my notes. Oh yeah, Kenobi has a camel with a foreskin for a face. It's got a big wrinkly long snout. Kidding aside, I had to be irreverent at some point. I liked it though, it was a cool creature. And he brings it home little treats and it gobbles them up with its prepuce. Space camel with an uncircumcised face. Anyway, had to get the inappropriate stuff out of my system. So there were a couple of scenes in the first episode that didn't really sit well with fans, including myself, because they seemed to depict Obi-Wan acting out of character, speaking or reacting in a way that seems out of alignment with the good old chivalrous Obi-Wan people, know and love. For instance, there's a scene where an idealistic, relatively young Jedi finds him in the desert and asks for his help, or asks him to join his cause, helping or defending the townsfolk, I think, probably against the Inquisitors, I imagine, and or something to that effect. And Obi-Wan just turns him down, tells him he should bury his lightsaber in the sand, and give up on the whole Jedi thing. And even though this seems harsh at first, I think it kind of makes sense. Not only is Kenobi still kind of dejected and broken at this point, but staying in hiding in order to protect Luke, a young boy at this point, is still his top priority, so he probably doesn't want to get involved in anything that might draw unwanted attention. But then Bail Organa, Jimmy Smits' character, and the adoptive father of Princess Leia, contacts Kenobi through some kind of emergency communicator Kenobi has squirreled away in his cave, and tells him that Leia has been kidnapped by Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers. True story, seriously. Flea plays some kind of criminal, and he and his gang abduct Leia. But Bail and his wife ask Obi-Wan to help find and rescue their daughter, but he says no, you're going to have to find somebody else. And at first, this really didn't sit well with me at all. I'm like, there's no way Obi-Wan Kenobi would refuse to help an old friend in need, especially if it involves saving a child. Princess Leia, no less. He was there when she and Luke were born. I know, I'm a nerd. But I think while watching it for the second time, I softened on the idea a bit and was like, maybe he's so broken at this point that he no longer believes in himself and sincerely thinks he wouldn't be of any use. And I think, for me at least, that brings up the question, what was the right direction for them to take the show in? Do we need a broken Kenobi? Sure, he probably would have been broken for a while after being forced to almost kill his best friend and experiencing Order 66 and the mass slaughter of his fellow Jedi. But would he still have been that broken and that disillusioned after all that time? And would he have given up and let himself get rusty the way we see in the show? How did he plan on protecting and eventually training Luke when he seems to have given up on training himself and buried his lightsaber in the sand? And speaking of that, they show him digging up his lightsaber, or sabers plural. I think Anakin's is there too. And they were buried in the middle of the desert with no trees or landmarkers around that I can see, not even a rock. Just undisturbed sand for as far as the eye can see. And somehow he knew exactly where to dig. I was like, wait, what? Maybe he can sense his lightsaber with the Force? Who knows? I guess conversely, instead of depicting him as being broken, they could have depicted him as being centered and focused and training every day. But would that be less compelling? Would it provide less of a character arc? Maybe they could have, at least just dialed back the brokenness a bit. Perhaps they could have depicted him as still being haunted by the past, which makes sense, but without making it seem like he constantly has his tail between his legs. But Obi-Wan does eventually agree to go find Leia, and another thing about that, Bail Organa is a senator, and I think his wife is the queen, once again, nerd, so they have all these resources and countless troops at their disposal, so why do they need this one particular guy to help find their daughter? I guess you could argue that as a Jedi, he's more formidable and more intuitive, and can maybe track a specific individual down on his own in a way an ordinary person can't, I guess. And I was just checking my notes, and this might seem like a small thing to some, but this caught my attention in the trailer too. We briefly see child Luke playing through the view of Obi-Wan's binoculars, and I couldn't help but notice that the kid seems to have dark hair, and of course Luke, Mark Hamill, is blonde. How hard is it to find a blonde kid? Maybe it's someone important's kid, or they just didn't care enough to get that little thing right. And once again, people notice that kind of thing, at least I do. And I've mentioned Leia several times now. When I first saw the kid who plays her, very quickly I thought, oh, that looks nothing like a young Carrie Fisher, or how I imagine a young Carrie Fisher would look at that age. She's supposed to be 10 in the show, but I thought I heard the actual actress maybe even younger. She looks pretty small. So at first I wasn't buying it, but once she started talking, I thought, wow, she gives a pretty mature or a skillful and nuanced performance for a child actor. She even nails or displays some of that trademark feisty or sarcastic Carrie Fisher / Leia attitude at times. There were a couple of chase scenes involving her that I found a little tedious, especially the scene where she's running off from Obi-Wan. There was one reviewer who took the video of one of the chase scenes, sped it up, and put the Benny Hill music to it, which I thought was pretty funny. I did like that moment, though, where she's running from Obi-Wan in the city, and she suddenly runs into this huge alien and just kind of looks up with this frozen oh shit look on her face, even after the alien walks away. The alien kind of reminded me of one of those giant monsters on The Muppet Show that eats people. Anyway, and apologies if some of these criticisms or observations seem out of chronological order. I took notes both the first and second time through, and they may be a bit jumbled. But next on my list, I had Uncle Owen. Even though he's kind of cantankerous and somewhat antagonistic towards the main character, I really like the actor's gruff yet down-to-earth performance. A little rough around the edges, a bit of a dick, but he cares and he's a good guy and means well under the gruff exterior. One of the better or more realistic performances, I thought. And so I mentioned that Kenobi eventually relents and agrees to go find Leia, and he ends up on this planet called Dayu, I think. He runs into this young street girl slinging drugs, and this girl had kind of an unusual, almost punk haircut, and also kind of unusual facial features, but not in a bad way. But she was so kind of unique looking that really caught my attention. Turns out that she's one of Ewan McGregor's daughters. I think he has more than one. I could be wrong about that. I believe she's 20 and her name is Esther Rose McGregor. So it was interesting. You had a real life father and daughter performing a scene together where the daughter's character is trying to sell her father's character drugs, while the father's character is searching for Leia, who within the narrative he's pretending is his daughter. A bit confusing, I know. But the drug she tries to sell him is called spice, which was also mentioned several times in the book of Boba Fett, I believe. And maybe I'm being too harsh, but there was something I thought was a little too convenient. His daughter, playing the drug dealer, gives him a complimentary bottle of spice. He doesn't want it, but she slips into his robe anyway. Then later, and this kind of interfered with my suspension of disbelief too, suddenly it's like an episode of Breaking Bad. Obi-Wan sneaks into a drug lab and he's wearing like the gear lab workers or drug cookers would wear. And it reminded me of that scene from the prequels where it looks like Obi-Wan sitting in a 50s diner and the big aliens dressed like a fry cook. It seems too much like something from Earth culture and it takes you out of it. But I guess, trying to be charitable, if there were humans elsewhere in space, their civilization would probably mirror ours in certain fundamental ways. They'd probably discover mind altering chemicals too, and would need a place to cook up their space drugs, I guess. But Flea is involved with this operation, and he and his gang catch Kenobi, back him up against a wall or into a corner, and take his lightsaber. And you're like, oh, how's he gonna get out of this one? Then suddenly he retrieves the bottle of spice from his robes and smashes it on the ground. The cloud and the distraction allow him to get away, and the thugs end up on the ground high as hell on the spice. And I remember when first watching that scene, I was like, oh, that was convenient. Good thing that girl just happened to give him that giant bottle of spice earlier. And that was supposed to be a free sample. Do you need a lot of that stuff to get high, or is he just a really generous drug dealer? And then comedic actor Camille Nanjiani, is that it, is in the show. And I kind of have mixed feelings about that. On the one hand, I think he's a fun and likable guy, but on the other hand, I'm not sure if his particular brand of humor is a good fit for Star Wars. It was kind of like one of those celebrity cameos that takes you out of the show or interferes with your suspension of disbelief. Kind of like Amy Sedaris' character on The Mandalorian. Is that her name, Amy Sedaris? But her character has kind of grown on me over time. But I'm glad there was a plot twist because at first they made Camille Nanjiani's character out to be a Jedi, and we see him doing things like using a Jedi mind trick on someone over the radio, and it's super cringy, and he's really hamming it up. Then it's revealed that it was just a grift and he's not really a Jedi, and that was a relief because before that reveal, I was like, oh man, is this show getting even worse than I thought? He does end up being a mensch, though, and he helps out Obi-Wan. He kinda gets between him and Riva, buying him time to escape with Leia. And that brings us to an inconsistency some people have noticed. Riva has the power to probe people's minds for information, which she uses on Camille Nanjiani's character, but conveniently she doesn't use that power earlier while threatening or interrogating Uncle Owen in Episode 1. If she had, she would have easily found out about Luke and the fact that he's Anakin's son. Was this just sloppy, inconsistent writing, or did they consciously choose not to have her probe Uncle Owen, which sounds kind of dirty? I don't know. Obviously, if they did have her probe him, his mind, not his butt, that would have taken the story in a much different, direction. Riva finding out about Luke and then potentially reporting it back to Vader. I don't know if that would break canon. I'm not sure how Vader found out that Luke was his son in the original movies. And I know I'm jumping around once again, but another thing that occurred to me about Camille Nanjiani's character is why pretend to be a Jedi? Aren't you risking unwanted attention from the Empire or getting your ass hunted by Inquisitors? Wouldn't it just be easier to upfront charge people money for finding them transport off world or whatever it was, instead of pretending you're a Jedi who's using the Force to convince the conductor over the radio? Because the conductor, or whoever it is on the other end of the radio, is only pretending to be influenced by the Force. They're actually in on it. Maybe he thinks that people will be more trusting of a Jedi, and that's why he does it. I'm trying to come up with some reason, trying to get inside the character's head. My guess is it's just some ham-handed concoction, some contrived way to try to utilize Camille Nanjiani's humor. And so, as I touched on earlier, the big cliffhanger at the end of episode 2 is Obi-Wan finding out from Riva that Anakin Skywalker is still alive. Oh my. And Ewan McGregor acts his ass off in this scene, pardon my French. But as I pointed out earlier, it really doesn't make much sense. He found it out a long time ago near the end of the prequels that Anakin was Vader. He saw the security footage of Palpatine calling him Vader or Lord Vader. And then he's aware of the Inquisitors once again. So you'd think he might also be aware of who they work for, or would have at least heard mention of Vader over the years. Vader is the Emperor's right-hand man. I'm sure there'd be some talk of him. I don't know where they get these writers. And actually, I have to admit, I've been recording this episode over the course of several days, and in the interim, an article came out in Bounding Into Comics about how, I imagine there's usually a team of writers on a big show like this, but they say that the writer hired to write this show, I guess, wasn't that familiar with Star Wars, or at least wasn't that familiar with Revenge of the Sith, the last prequel movie where we had Hayden, I almost said Anakin, Hayden Christensen and Ewan McGregor together. And that's why, if you're going to make a show that picks up where that last movie in the prequel trilogy leaves off, maybe you'd want to go back and watch that movie, or maybe, hire a writer who actually knows Star Wars, or a team of people containing some real, Star Wars nerds, or writers, or just people who are familiar with the canon and the lore, who've seen all the movies, know them inside out, who know the comics, who know all the different spin-offs. It makes sense to me. When you have a beloved franchise like this that is worth so much money, why wouldn't you put together a team of people who knows everything about the franchise inside and out, man? But it blows my mind. It seems like I don't know what it is, man. They hire people who aren't as familiar as they should be with the source material. And I know they probably had their hands full, but seems like a sin not to have at least Filoni and Favreau involved with this. It's the Kenobi series, pretty big deal. But anyway, on to the third episode. And did I say this was going to be a quick review? Apologies, almost a half hour in now. And so I think a lot of people had a similar reaction to the third episode as myself, really looking forward to it, hoping it was going to be epic, and then just left feeling that it was rather lackluster or that something was off. So episode 2 ended with Anakin, aka Darth Vader, opening his eyes in a Bacta tank. And for you non-Star Wars nerds, a Bacta tank, I think we first see them, or see one, in Empire Strikes Back, where Luke is being healed, right? It's like a tank that you soak in to speed up the healing process. I think they have them in Dragon Ball Z too, but they don't call them Bacta tanks. Now I must really sound like a nerd. Anyway, so we're left thinking, we might get to see some Vader in the next episode. Perhaps even the first showdown between him and Obi-Wan. And we do indeed get that. And we get to see the process of Anakin having his mechanical limbs and suit attached, which was pretty cool, and maybe I'm being too nitpicky again, but I felt like the CGI may have been a bit iffy at times. They were showing these big mechanical limbs being attached, but it didn't feel like they had weight. It was like you were looking at, what you were, a computerized animation. But yeah, a little iffy during that scene, but I appreciate the intricacy of the design exciting getting to see all these different complex parts coming together to form the suit. So the now suited up Vader and the Inquisitors eventually track Kenobi, who's still in the process of trying to get Leia home, to this planet. And I believe Kenobi and the gang are about to enter this tunnel that will take them to a transport, but Kenobi suddenly senses Vader's presence. It almost seems to overwhelm or sicken him. He keeps peeking out the window of the little house or building they're in, and he can see Vader approaching. He tells a female ally they made to make sure Leia gets to Alderaan and to go on without him. And I don't know if I'm the only one, but I thought this final part of episode 3 had a very kind of surreal, almost dream or nightmare-like quality to it. I think partly it was probably intentional. They probably wanted to convey some of what Obi-Wan was supposed to be feeling, the dread and helplessness via the mood of the scene. Because I think for him, this version of Obi-Wan we got, this moment is supposed to be like a nightmare. And I think partly the off-putting weirdness of it might have just been due to some questionable cinematography as well. But the scene takes place at night, and we see Vader making his way down a dark street, trying to sense Obi-Wan's location, and I imagine he was doing this to try to bait Obi-Wan or lure him out, or maybe he did it just for fun. But as he's walking, he's killing and force-choking innocent people. He uses the Force to snap a kid's neck in front of his father, and to drag an innocent woman behind him down the street. Yeah, really dark stuff. And one thing I noticed, and here's yet another little nitpick, but as Vader's walking down the street, it seems, way too quiet. They zoom in on his boots, but you don't really hear much. I think if they added some heavy footfalls, it would have added some, additional weight and menace. And so Obi-Wan's like Shaggy from Scooby-Doo, even kind of looks like him. And he wants none of this stuff, man. He's just kind of inside peeking through the window, or peeking out the window. But eventually, Obi-Wan does end up outside. And it seems like he's trying to flee, but suddenly Vader appears and ignites his saber. And I think that's another thing that added to the surreal feel of this scene, is that the glow of the lightsabers at night seems very big, like the spread or coverage of the light, and it added this kind of weird neon glow to the faces of the characters and the surrounding area. So yeah, kind of really weird. And so Obi-Wan draws his lightsaber as if he's going to ignite it, but then he's like, screw this, and runs off. It almost looks like they're fighting in a rock quarry or something, with Obi-Wan running off behind the mounds of earth or rock, while Vader pursues him like Jason Voorhees. Strange scene. And I know this whole review, it's probably just sounded like I'm being really, really critical. But there was something about the... Why not keep going in that direction? There was something about the cinematography in the scene that I thought made Vader's suit look kind of cheap, or the angles failed to make him look intimidating or menacing or something. He just looked like a guy in a plastic suit being filmed at night, which is pretty much what it was. I think multiple people have said that it kind of had the feeling of a fan film. And one of my major qualms with this scene was the lack of meaningful dialogue. It's been 10 years since these characters have come face to face, and in fairness, there was one cool exchange where Obi-Wan says, "What have you become?" and Vader's reply is, "I am what you have made me," or something to that effect. But even that exchange seemed to lack weight for some reason. I think it was just the way it was shot. But it would have been good if at least once they had Obi-Wan call Vader Anakin and try to, albeit futilely, try to appeal to his humanity or reason with him. Of course it wouldn't have worked, but I think it would have seemed fitting to at least see Obi-Wan try. And I know you don't necessarily want a lot of exposition, and sometimes actions speak louder than words, but I feel like just a few bits of well-worded dialogue could have made the characters seem more connected. And on the subject of dialogue, I have to say I haven't been crazy about Vader's lines in general, and another common complaint I've been hearing is that the writing in general on this show, including the dialogue, is just kind of subpar. And obviously that's kind of subjective, but I've been hearing that a lot from other reviewers, and I would tend to agree. But getting back to Vader, Vader doesn't say much in this show, so when he does, you pay attention or it stands out. And there were a couple of Vader lines I thought were kind of generic or could have been retooled or improved. For instance, he's talking to Riva and he says something like, "If you fail, you will not live long enough to regret it." And it's clear and it gets the point across, and the sentiment is fitting for Vader. But it seemed a bit, like I said, generic or blunt or unimaginative. I thought it may have been better if he had said something like, "I need not remind you of the penalty for failure." The threat would still be there, but there'd also be that facade of decorum. And Obi-Wan finally ignites his saber, and there's what many have complained was a kind of lackluster sword or lightsaber fight. Rumor has it that there'll be a second showdown, and thusly I think some are hoping, including myself, that this duel kind of intentionally sucked because Obi-Wan is supposed to be rusty, and the second fight will be the big comeback bout, and will hopefully be a more impressive spectacle. We can hope. Yeah, Obi-Wan doesn't last too long against Vader. He gets force choked and drops his saber and gets dragged through some flames. And that brings us to the other Vader line that I just felt could have been better for some reason. As he's dragging Kenobi through the flames with the force, he says, "Now you will suffer, Obi-Wan." Not bad, appropriate. We know what it's referring to when Obi-Wan left Anakin for dead, burning on Mustafar minus 3 limbs. But I thought maybe it would have been better if he said something like, "Now, old friend, you'll burn as I did." Maybe that's worse, I don't know. But once again, I'd like a bit of slightly more intimate dialogue that emphasizes the connection and history between the two characters. And the scene ends in kind of a weird way. Vader uses the Force to put out the flames because he wants to stretch out Kenobi's suffering. He doesn't want him to die too quickly. Some stormtroopers move forward to collect Kenobi, and Kenobi's female ally shoots from up on a cliff. The fire Vader just put out gets reignited. Vader's on one side of the flames and Obi-Wan's on the other. This really slow-moving droid comes and rescues Kenobi while Vader just stares. So fans were wondering, why didn't Vader just walk through the flames or just grab Kenobi with the Force again? We can only hope it's because he has a plan. Maybe he's letting them escape because he wants to track them back to their base or something. Otherwise, it's just shit writing. Okay, so I was nearly done with this review, but then episode 4 came out, so I guess I'll offer my thoughts on that one as well. Why not? And I have to say, while first viewing the 4th episode, I found myself thinking that it might be my favorite so far, but after becoming aware of some valid criticisms some other reviewers, am I a reviewer? I'm a content creator, and sometimes I review stuff. Close enough. But anyway, some other reviewers had, and watching it through again, I started to see why this episode has really been getting so heavily panned. A lot of people, even those who had been defending the show up until that point, started saying that this was the worst episode yet and that the writing, was just terrible. I think the reason why I had such a favorable view of it at first is that I was just pleased and relieved to see Obi-Wan acting like Obi-Wan again. There was something very nostalgic about it. We had, Obi-Wan infiltrating an Imperial base, actually acting like Obi-Wan, brave and confident, slicing up stormtroopers, swinging his lightsaber around, and they got it right this time. The stormtroopers actually had burn marks on their armor. And once again, they had it right the first time, too. I just failed to notice. But even though I was happy to suddenly have the old Obi-Wan back, the change in demeanor or personality almost felt too sudden. One moment you can't get the guy to help anyone, he's all get someone else, and he was shaking in his boots around Vader. Now suddenly he doesn't even think twice about infiltrating a scary-looking Imperial base in the middle of the ocean. If I was going to be charitable, I'd say it was his care and concern for Leia and the realization of how serious the danger she was in was that kind of helped awaken his old self. But still, the sudden change in personality was kind of jarring or odd. I think they could have demonstrated or stretched out that transition, more artfully. They did a similar thing earlier in the same episode. Obi-Wan goes to this base or location operated by, I guess, what we'd call the Resistance. I don't know if the rebellion proper exists yet. Anyway, and he asks for help from this character who's played by Ice Cube's son. The character's like, I'm not helping you. You'll bring too much attention, paraphrasing. Then suddenly, a minute later, he's like, you want my help? You got it. And who knows, maybe Obi-Wan's story turned him around, but it still seemed odd. I almost wondered if they were trying to parallel or do a callback to Obi-Wan's attitude earlier in the show, where he was reluctant to help others, and now the shoe's on the other foot, so kind of a little moral lesson, perhaps. But one thing a lot of people were complaining about was the interrogation scene between Riva and Leia. People just didn't like the acting or the way it was written. I just found it to be kind of boring, to be honest, but it didn't really bother me any more than any of the other parts or scenes I've griped about so far. Another thing people pointed out that I kind of picked up on the first time through, but kind of let go for some reason, is where Kenobi's female allies, that his ally that I've mentioned several times now, I believe her character's name is Tala or something like that, and the actress is Indira Varma, I believe. She's a British actress who's partly of Indian descent. She was on Game of Thrones, and I remember being young and randy and seeing her in a movie that came out, that came out in the 90s entitled Karma Sutra, A Tale of Love. She has some pretty risque scenes in that. I remember them well. Anyway, her character is dressed like an Imperial officer. I believe the character's backstory is that she was an Imperial officer that became disillusioned and decided to help the Resistance or something like that. So she's dressed like an Imperial officer, and she's sitting at a control panel with another officer sitting about 3 feet away from her at the same panel, as she's talking into a microphone instructing Obi-Wan how to infiltrate the base. And then there was another part people have just been having a field day, talking about, where they finally have Leia and they're trying to escape. The base is on full or high alert. And they try to quickly walk out of the base or back to their ship or whatever, because I believe they're high up and it's surrounded by ocean. But they're trying to make their way across this big open platform or deck teeming with officers and stormtroopers on high alert. The Tala character still has her Imperial uniform on, but Obi-Wan is wearing an Imperial officer's hat and a big rumpled trench coat with Leia hiding under it. People were saying that he kind of looked like a bum, or that it was kind of like the Little Rascals or one of those old cartoons where 2 or more kids stand on each other's shoulders under a trench coat to try to look like an adult. In fairness, they do get caught or stopped, which they probably deserve for not having a better escape plan. But they do, of course, escape. The cavalry, I almost said Calvary, which is the hill Christ was crucified upon. I used to get that mixed up as a kid. Cavalry is, guys on horses. Calvary is the hill Christ died on. Anyway, the proverbial cavalry arrives and blasts the Imperials so they can get away. And the little ships the Resistance fighters were flying that saved them looked really weird. Not so much the design of the ships themselves, but more the perspective or lack thereof. It's like the CGI was really bad and there was no sense of depth or, once again, perspective. It was like, are they big ships that are far away or little ships that are really close? And one of the pilots, Wade, dies. Poor Wade. You don't know who Wade is, neither do I. Throwaway character with no plot armor. I like how in Star Wars there will be all these exotic alien names, then once in a while you get an Earth name sprinkled in, like Wade or Luke. How about Doug? Doug the Hutt. And then someone else made the great point that one of the first things we see about this base earlier on is that it's got a hangar full of TIE fighters. And yet, no fighters are deployed to chase the resistance at the end of the episode. Did the writers just forget? Or maybe the production team or someone thought they'd be a nice touch, but the writers and visual artists, weren't on the same page, literally. Let's just chalk it up to sloppy writing again. And concerning, whether or not Vader intentionally let Obi-Wan go at the end of episode 3, and we were hoping that was the case because otherwise it would probably mean it was just bad writing. Well, we get an answer of sorts. Vader erupts at Riva at the end of episode 4 for allowing Kenobi and the others to escape, but lets her live because she informs him that she slipped a tracker on them. And it was kind of comical and out of character. Vader has her up in the air choking her. Then it's like, oh, okay, sets her back down. A tracker, why didn't you say so? So apparently Vader hadn't previously been tracking them, which probably means there wasn't any nefarious plan to follow them, and he did just let Kenobi go the first time because fire makes me lazy. Some were trying to say maybe Vader was afraid of fire, like Frankenstein, or Frankenstein's monster, technically, because that's how he almost died, and that's why he didn't walk through the flames. But others have also rightfully pointed out dude still lives on Mustafar, the volcano planet where he burnt up like a marshmallow. I don't know, man. Getting Hayden Christensen and Ewan McGregor back to help fill in this area on the Star Wars timeline, for lack of a better way of putting it, or to help tell this part of their character's shared story, is, I imagine, a one-shot deal. No do-overs. And you wasted the opportunity. Pissed it away, so to speak, with sloppy writing and what should have been easily avoided plot holes. Once again, why didn't they just assemble a team of people that know the franchise, the canon, and lore inside out? Kind of makes me shake my head, I don't know. Anyway, there's 2 episodes left. If I had to rate it so far on a scale of 1 to 10, I'd probably give it a 6, and I'll probably still watch the last 2 episodes just to see where it goes. Oh, and I realized I skipped over something in my notes. Episode 4 starts out with this kind of dueling back-to-tank scene. They flash back and forth between Obi-Wan and Anakin in their back-to-tanks. Cool idea, but visually not very impressive. And that's another one of my big gripes with this show. We really don't get much Hayden Christensen. I believe he's only in the suit part of the time. I was just reading an article where they go into how another guy who happens to be 6'7" is in the full body shots, and another guy supposedly does the fighting. The voice is a combination of James Earl Jones and some kind of voice technology, AI or whatever. So most of what we get with Hayden is the back-to-tank scenes, and it's cloudy and you can't really see his face. We don't even get a good shot of those cool red and yellow Sith eyes. Just had to throw out that one last complaint. Okay, so I'm going to have to eat my proverbial hat, because I recently watched episode 5, and we get a metric buttload of Hayden Christensen. I don't think that's a real unit of measurement. Anyway, we get a fairly long flashback scene of Obi-Wan and Anakin sparring with their lightsabers. They're just practicing. It takes place before Revenge of the Sith, so they're still Master and Padawan at this point. The flashback scene is broken up into segments that are peppered throughout the episode. And I think my theory about the saber duel in episode 3 intentionally sucking may be right, because the lightsaber choreography was really good in this episode. Since the flashback scene is supposed to take place so long ago, they had to use de-aging technology on Ewan McGregor and Hayden Christensen's faces, so they'd look something like they did when they filmed the prequels. But I thought they could have let that deepfake bake a bit longer. I think it seemed more noticeable with Hayden than with Ewan, but the quality of the de-aging seemed to fluctuate at times. You could see Hayden's age showing through. And Hayden looks good. He's a handsome, in shape 41-year-old guy, but I believe he was supposed to be a teenager when he was still training under Obi-Wan, and sometimes it looked like a 40-year-old man's face on a teenage character. It was kind of odd. But the scene was still well choreographed and well acted. You could tell Hayden in particular was really giving it his all. I appreciated the passion in his performance. And the general consensus seems to be, at least among reviewers I watch on YouTube, etc., that there was a lot to love about this episode, that it might be the best one yet, but at the same time it was still plagued by some plot holes and problematic writing. We find out what we already knew due to leaks that came out a while ago. Riva switches sides. It turns out, as many of us guessed, that she was one of the younglings at the temple we see at the beginning when it was attacked by the clone troopers. It's probably inaccurate to say she quote-unquote switched sides, because I'm not sure she necessarily allied herself with Kenobi, and I still wouldn't say she's good. We saw her do some reprehensible stuff over the course of the show, like chopping off an innocent person's hand, but she does turn on Vader. It's revealed that she witnessed Anakin killing the other younglings, and the show seems to suggest that he ran her through with his lightsaber, but she survived. But the scene where she fights Vader is pretty epic. She tries to sneak up on him, but he senses her and freezes her with the Force as he slowly turns around like some movie monster. He proceeds to absolutely dominate her without really expending much effort, and when he's done playing with her, he runs her through. And they go back and forth between past and present, showing her being run through as a child and now again as an adult. Some have tried to argue he didn't stab her as a child, but it seems, that's what the show is strongly suggesting. As she's lying on the floor, the Grand Inquisitor and Vader look down at her. The Grand Inquisitor gets a quip in, and they both walk off. I think that we're supposed to assume that Vader let her live out of sadism, that he wanted her to suffer alone, dying from her wound. But others have also pointed out that this seems a bit weird. She tried to take him out, and she also knows his true identity. Why wouldn't he just finish her off? Others have also mentioned something that occurred to me as well. It's like, wait, this one person got run through by Vader twice in their life and managed to survive both times? I don't know if that makes them very lucky or very unlucky. And there was another thing that took me out of the show a bit. Earlier in the episode, Bail Organa messages Obi-Wan and he's kind of like, haven't heard from you in a while. Hope my daughter's still alive, paraphrasing for a comedic effect, and because I'm too lazy to track down the exact dialogue verbatim. And then he basically says, if you don't return, I'll go to Tatooine and look after the boy, or something like that. Why would he divulge that information over a communicator, the signal of which could be intercepted by the Empire? It seemed like a bit of clumsy writing and a bit too convenient. The communicator gets lost, and what do you know? It's on the floor near where Riva's lying, and she crawls over to it and plays the message. So it looks like she'll most likely be paying Luke a visit in episode 6. I had a couple of other little nitpicks. There's a really cool moment where Vader uses the Force to pull down a ship and then starts ripping off pieces of the hull. But like with the speeders at the end of episode 4, I kind of thought the perspective on the CGI ship may have been a bit off. It was hard to get a feel for what size it was supposed to be in relation to Vader. Not a big deal, but it seemed like maybe the CGI or lighting or something could have been tweaked. Then there was the part where a little 10-year-old Leia volunteers to crawl into a duct and fix a broken or jammed overhead hangar door or hatch. I'm like, A, why are the ducts or vents so small? And B, how the heck does a 10-year-old who was brought up as a princess know how to fix that kind of thing? In fairness, Camille Nanjiani's character does tell her that it was specifically a red breaker, so that makes it a little more believable, I think. But even that one wasn't that big a deal, once again, just a nitpick. Then there was the scene where Riva and Obi-Wan are having a whispery discussion about whether or not she should turn against Vader with a whole horde or a whole army of stormtroopers nearby. But I have to say, looking for screenshots to use for this YouTube version of the review has required me to revisit the episodes again, and I found that certain things have grown on me a bit, or I find myself being less critical. For instance, the scene where Vader is walking down the street at night searching for Obi-Wan, after repeated viewing, it becomes much more clear that he does sense Obi-Wan and that he's tormenting the citizens in an attempt to lure him out. The first time I watched it, that scene seemed a little confused. I mean, I had the basic hunch that was what was going on, but at the same time, the way it was shot, it didn't feel like that was crystal clear. The first time through, it's dark out, all of a sudden, Vader's walking down the street, yanking people out of windows, etc. And so I feel like I've been editing this forever, and I believe we're getting near the end. So one more time, we now resume the week in doubt already in progress. So, my apologies to my regular listeners who maybe aren't sci fi geeks. Sorry for putting you through this. I hope someone enjoyed this. And as always, thanks for listening, everyone. And I promise to bring you some more kind of regular content that's more in the show's wheelhouse next time. All right.